Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's second free webinar of 2021 with the very excellent title, How to Make More Rational Decisions at Work. This webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I am a business journalist at Smith School of Business. I'm also your host and moderator today for the discussion. Before I introduce today's guest speaker, I want to remind you, as I always do, that this discussion is going to be recorded, and you'll be getting a link to Dr. Rees' presentation in your inbox in the days to come, so keep an eye out for that. If you want to ask a question, and I strongly encourage you to do so, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will be, Dr. Rees will be making her presentation, and then we'll be turning to questions in the latter half of the presentation. We are going to try to keep this one to 45 minutes, but if we get lots of questions, we will go over. We do our best to get to all the questions, but get your questions in early and often, and we'll get to them as we can. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Dr. Laura Rees. Dr. Rees studies emotions and the related cognitive and interpersonal influences that often arise spontaneously and without much conscious thought, but that profoundly shape a person's decision-making, negotiations, performance, and well-being at work. Her research has been published in many major academic journals, and before her academic career, she was a consultant for the Boston Consulting Group, where she focused on clients in the retail and consumer packaged goods industries. I do want to mention that Dr. Rees has an undergrad in economics from Harvard University and did her graduate work in organizational behavior at the University of Michigan. Laura, thank you for being here today. I'm going to turn the floor to you and return once your presentation's over. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Meredith, and I'm so excited and happy to be here today. So I am sharing slides. Hopefully someone will give me a warning somewhere if you're not actually seeing those. You see a lovely carton of eggs with some different emotional expressions on this first slide. And it's indeed a really tall order to tell you everything that exists about how we perceive people and situations, and often misperceive those people and situations, including ourselves, in only half an hour, 45 minutes or thereabouts. So I'll cover a little bit of information using a framework that I like to use, with the caveat that so much more exists. There are many ways that you can think about issues like this. And so I'm excited to share with you some initial thoughts and really look forward to your questions. So I do hope that you will start thinking of those, and I'm excited to have a conversation with you about them as we get towards the end. And the framework that I'll use today is what's called the ABCs. And this was actually originally, I believe, developed to discuss attitude research. But I find it actually quite useful to think about many aspects of life. And so I'll actually go through that with you today in the context of perceptions and misperceptions and how we see ourselves, others, in situations. And those ABCs actually refer to emotions, or what's broadly called affect. And affect is actually just a broader term, meaning both sort of in the moment emotions about a particular target, but also more generalized and diffuse moods. So feeling good, bad, this kind of thing. That's referred to as affect. Behaviors, that goes without explaining, I think, and then our cognitions, largely, which have to do with our expectations and the frames that we approach the world with. So again, this is only one framework to think about issues like this, and I'll actually take this a bit out of order. So I'll talk about affect and then cognitions and then behaviors to a little bit more accurately reflect how things actually happen. That said, of course, these are feedback loops, and so behaviors influence affect, and it kind of cycles through. But I find this a helpful way to think through sort of from the very beginning with affect through thinking and then to the behaviors that we engage in. And how I'll organize each of these sections is actually give you 3 common pitfalls, and not all pitfalls, but just 3 common ones on each of these 3 sections, and then discuss both some theoretical research that we know about how these work, and then what that often looks like and how we can address that in practice. Okay, so getting started with affect. This is a lot of my own research, so I get very excited to talk about this. As Meredith mentioned, my background is actually in economics, very rational based. And one of my very first learnings when I started my graduate work was realizing that emotions aren't irrational. This dichotomy is actually, in fact, false. And because from some of the very pitfalls that we find ourselves in when we think about affect. And the first one is that we often just simply misinterpret what we're seeing, both ourselves and other people. One of my favorite theories in emotions research is what's called the emotions as social information. so EC. And this actually just argues that evolutionarily and fundamentally, emotions are as much, if not more, about helping a perceiver or the other person as they are for helping ourselves. So you could argue, for example, a lot of the function of expressions or things like this in emotions is not so much to help me, the expressor or the feeler, but to help you understand what's happening in the situation and how you can react to it. But as I always joke with my students, and I never laugh, emotions is social information, but it's not EC. This is actually a really complicated thing that happens interpersonally to make sense of. And one of the best examples in practice I can give you is you think about a smile. And of course, there are cultural variations and situational variations and individual differences in how and when we express a smile. But it's hands down, one of the most ubiquitous expressions that we see in daily life. And we think, well, I have so much experience with it. I express it a lot myself. So I know how to understand a smile. I know what it means. But the interesting thing about smiles is that some argue there are up to 19 different meanings behind a simple smile. So sure, it can indicate happiness. That's probably fairly obvious. But it can also indicate embarrassment, anger, shyness, politeness, or even just simply to indicate that I'm listening to you with a myriad of other interpretations. So even when you think about one of the most common, seemingly simple expressions that we make on a daily basis, it can actually be incredibly complex to unpack and understand what it means. And you'll notice in that short list I gave you, which isn't even all 19, you see huge differences in positive, negative, sort of good, bad, judgment-based differences in that smile. We also miss a lot of information as we're seeing and experiencing affect. Probably all of you have heard of the phrase of emotional intelligence and some of the research that's been done on that. Basically, how good are you at recognizing, managing, using, experiencing emotions in your daily life, in your workplace. In practice, this has so many different dimensions. I could actually do an entire course just on this idea itself. First of all, we know there are huge cultural differences, also across workplaces in many different aspects. A couple that I've mentioned here are what's called ideal affect. So again, if you think about something like a smile, what that means, how big it is, what's normative and how you express that smile, there are large differences across culture in what is considered ideal to express, to what intensity and to what extent and when. So for example, if you take typical, and this is kind of stereotypical, so again, there are huge cultural and individual and contextual differences, but a prototypical Western idea of happiness is a very emotive, excited, broad smile type of expression. In many Eastern cultures and in other contexts, what's considered ideal to express is actually much calmer, less dramatically expressive kind of calmness, in a sense. One of the best studies I've seen about this actually is Jean Tsai's work on children's storybooks. And you can actually analyze the characters' expressions in storybooks from the East and the West, and you can see distinct differences in how these characters express emotion in those storybooks, whether it's a very emotive, high intensity, more broad, free expression, or more muted, calm, sort of constrained, regulated expression. That also kind of brings into the picture this idea of expressivity differences across both cultures and individuals. So how much and how intense we express the emotions that we feel can really differ. Naturally, for example, I'm actually really quite an expressive, if you couldn't tell, person. And so a broad expression or a really intense expression for me might mean something very different from that same intensity expression level from someone who's much less expressive on a normal basis. So seeing the same information can actually mean different things across people, even assuming we see that same information across people. And there are lots of individual and even cultural differences too, in what's called emotion granularity. And that literally means how granular you get when you think about emotions and label them and understand them. So how specific and detailed are you? If you come out of a work meeting, for example, and you're frowning and somebody says, what's wrong, what's happening? And you say, well, that meeting, I feel upset. What do you mean by upset? Do you mean perhaps upset is a much broader category, but you could be feeling angry at the new strategic change that was just announced. You could be feeling disappointed in how the leadership didn't involve people in that change. Or you could be feeling frustrated that your area is maybe tasked with leading this change without full buy-in, or something like this. And those three emotions, those categories, are much more granular, specific, and narrowly defined than just saying I feel upset. But again, different information. So if we see someone and just think they look upset, that's quite a different level and content of information than saying they look angry and frustrated and disappointed. Okay, and so besides the fact that we miss a lot of information, we misinterpret some of the information that we see, we're actually sometimes also influenced without even realizing it, which is one of my sort of favorite things to think about. And this is where we can get a lot of practice and actually do a lot of things ourselves to make this better. And a few theories that apply here. Our first is this idea that emotions are primary. So many researchers, and I am one of these, argue that emotions actually precede cognition. So to say things like, it's not emotional, it's just rational, or keep your emotions out of it, sort of misses the point in a sense, because it's too late. They've already happened. Even if you think that you're being very cognitive and rational and not emotional about it, your emotions have actually already come into play. You may just not have recognized the influence that they're having. If you've heard of system 1 versus system 2 processing, for example, those are theories that kind of get at this idea that emotions are primary. And actually research in neuroscience shows us that if you damage parts of the brain that process emotion are damaged in some way, it actually severely influences your ability to think cognitively. So again, this idea of emotions are primary, and so they're actually influencing us before we've really even thought about them. The idea of core affect are used that in some sense, our initial feeling of an emotion is actually more of a generalized, not so well-defined sense of good and positive versus bad and negative. And then it's actually only when we put some kind of appraisal or framing or labeling on that, that we realize, oh, it's not just that I feel bad and negative, I'm actually angry, or I'm afraid, or put some sort of label on it that gives us more information about what's actually happening in that situation. But none of that can happen if we don't learn to recognize those initial cues and actually get over the bias that we think that our emotions aren't actually influencing us. One of my favorite examples of this is an excellent study done on parole decisions with judges in Israel. And let me give you a bit of a scene before I show you the graph that I think is one of the most striking graphs I've seen to summarize this kind of data and this kind of effect. So there was a series of judges, these are Israeli judges, looking at parole decisions. The important thing to note is that the decisions to be made were not in any specific order or assigned to any specific judge. So any effects were not because certain judges were seeing more difficult cases or easier cases, or were seeing the hardest cases first or the easiest cases first or anything like this. So there's no order effects or any differences across judges like this. But there was an analysis done of the approval rate of these parole requests. And it wasn't that the crimes were harder or more violent or something like this in any particular order. And what you see here on the x-axis is the ordinal position of that decision, that specific case. So did it come at the beginning, the middle, the end? And then the proportion of favorable decisions. And this is across all judges in this sample. And you'll see a few things. So first, you might say, well, an average judge, on average, would approve less than half of the parole decisions. That doesn't seem very striking. In fact, a judge might say, well, I actually have a lot of variation in the decisions that I approve versus not. I'm approving less than half, so that doesn't seem as if I'm biased in any way. And I don't see any pattern if you just looked kind of on average, of course, across the course of the day and how I'm approving or not approving these decisions. But you'll see from this graph, there's something very striking happening here. So it goes from approving about 2/3 to almost 0. And then something dramatic happens to about, and then it comes back to about the same rate, and then again decreases, and then the same thing. And the interesting thing about what happens at these 2 points in time, and this is where I would always ask my students, what do you think? And then have all these great ideas. The judges took a food break. They literally just had a snack. No judge would have said I'm biased. Probably most professionals would say, you know, a snack won't really change my opinion because I'm doing this professionally. This is what I'm paid to do. This is what I'm highly trained to do. And the difference was a snack. And there's a lot of research. They didn't ask the judges their mood in this case, but there's a lot of research that does correlate this link between the mind and the body as very strong and often very influential in really surprising ways. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, before we move on to cognition, I wanted to show you a small video. And Meredith, I'll trust if for some reason the sound isn't working, just give me a flag and I'll restart it. It's very short, just a couple of minutes. And I want you to watch this and just be attuned to what you're thinking and feeling as you watch it. And think in particular, were you surprised at any point? And I would hazard the guess that no matter your reaction to this video, that tells you actually something really interesting about your cognitive processing and how you're thinking and feeling about what you see here. And I'll give a caveat. So this is actually an ad. I didn't create this video, but it struck me as so powerful. I did want to include this today. Now, this is the point when, if we were live, I'd really love to hear some of your thoughts about the video that you just saw. But one of the points that it illustrates for me really quite powerfully and impactfully, actually, is that we often see what we're looking for, and in some sense, exactly what we're looking for. There's some great work, and if any of you have taken a basic kind of cognitive processing or bias or even psychology course, you may have heard of the phrase of inattentional blindness. And it basically just means we're actually quite good at paying attention to what we want to pay attention to. In fact, sometimes so good that we filter out things that we shouldn't, even when they're very useful or very surprising or we should have recognized. One of the most popular studies done on this, and many of you probably have seen these videos, and it's been replicated in many different ways and over the years, is a study of basketballs and gorillas. So you say, what does this have to do with cognitive processing and perception and misperception? So it's just a really simple illustration of how we process what we're seeing and how we actually find what we're looking for. So this study had people come in and watch a video, and the idea was, the cover story was that you should count the number of times this group of people wearing, black t-shirts or white t-shirts passed a basketball back and forth. And you were told, well, the team wearing white, count how many passes there are. And by the way, it's very important that you're accurate. Okay, so you're motivated to do this task. You want to be accurate. This is many of us in our workplaces every day. And it's a lot of confusing passing back and forth. People are standing in a room and passing in all different directions. And unbeknownst to the participants, in the middle of all of this passing, a gorilla, a person in a full-body gorilla costume, comes into the room, slowly walks across, and then exits. And there have been many variations of this. Sometimes it's a person with an umbrella or something like this. So basically something you should have noticed. This is shocking, surprising, completely unexpected in the scene, but it's actually an amazingly few number of people who actually noticed that they saw something amiss in this picture. The effect is less if you're told to watch the players wearing the black shirts, because ostensibly the black color of the gorilla is closer in a sense to what you're trying to pay attention to, so you're more likely to see it. But it's amazing when you think about how we can filter out something so bizarre, in a sense, that we don't even see it, because we weren't looking for something like that. Now, you might say, this is very cute. What does this have to do with the workplace? It doesn't really matter. It won't influence my life. Well, here is one replication of that study done with experts in a way that I think will disturb you enough to pay attention to this kind of effect in your own life. So they looked at radiologists, professional radiologists, and they had them analyze different scans to say, do you see anything unusual in this? So this is literally what the radiologists are paid to do. They're highly trained professionals. This is very sensitive and important work. And what the radiologists didn't know was that, and part of this is in homage to the original study with basketballs, the researchers had inserted an image of a gorilla, the outline, 48 times the size of the average nodule that the radiologist was supposed to be able to detect in these X-ray images. So something that for sure should have caught their attention. 83% of the radiologists did not see the gorilla, even though eye tracking software shows that the majority of the radiologists actually looked at the exact spot on the X-ray where the gorilla image appeared. So this idea that we see what we're looking for and miss what we're not looking for is just so powerful. Besides that, so besides the fact that we see what we want to see and miss what we don't want to see, we can also shape the future in sometimes really dramatic ways without actually meaning to. Self-fulfilling prophecies is one of the best ways to illustrate this idea. And one example that I love to share, it's a classic study, it's Clever Hans. Hans was a horse, and it turned out people were really fascinated by Clever Hans. It seemed that this horse could actually do pretty high level cognitive thinking, could add, could tell days of the week, and this kind of thing. So it was a lot of really attention, public media paid to this horse in Germany, because you could say, you know, Hans, what is 3 + 5? And Hans would tap his hoof 8 times, and you think this is amazing. But here is the difference, and what explains this effect. Was Hans actually that clever? Yes, but not in the way that we thought. It turns out Hans got the right answer when he could see the person asking the question and when that person knew the answer. If those things weren't true, his accuracy fell from 89% to only 6%, which basically means he was just tapping sort of without a purpose. And the way that this is explained is because when you know the answer, what Hans was clever at was detecting these small, subtle cues, these tensing of muscles and releasing them as he got closer to the answer. And he could tell when to stop tapping his hoof based on the physical reactions, the very subtle, completely unintentional physical reactions of the question asker. That explains why he couldn't answer when he couldn't see the question asker or when the question asker didn't know the answer themselves, because then there's no way for them to give that cue. And the question asker was not intending to bias the results in any way. They were just curious about what was happening. We can change the future, even as we're in it, even as maybe we're not seeing what we should be seeing because we're not trying to pay attention to it, in ways that we can't even tell. There are 2 other effects that I should mention here that are related to the idea of self-fulfilling prophecies. One is the Pygmalion effect, if you know the old literature story on Pygmalion. The other is the opposite of that, which is the Gollum effect. And in short, they basically explain that people live up to or down to the expectations that we hold for them often. There's a lot of research on teachers, managers, etc., who have high expectations for a student or an employee, and that employee or student lives up to those high expectations, which can often be manipulated through no fault of the student or employee. And in the same sense, and this is the more dangerous side, people can live down to low expectations as well, because you're subtly changing the future based on your own expectations without even intending to do so. So to add on to this as well is the idea of heuristics, and you may have heard of heuristics and biases, a lot of the wonderful work by Kahneman and Tversky, thinking fast and slow, that system 1, system 2 processing, if you've read some of the books and work on this, and we often do it unconsciously. A couple of different ways this shows up. a lot of different heuristics that we use to take shortcuts in our decision making and in our processing of what's happening in any given situation. One of the more common famous examples in what's called the conjunction fallacy is the Linda problem. Some of you may have even encountered this if you took a statistics course or something like this. And I'll read you a version of this, slightly updated for recent years, and see if you would, how you would answer this question. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which is more probable? A, Linda is a bank teller, or B, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the Me Too movement. Now, if you fell prey to what's called a representativeness bias, because it seems to make sense, given the description I gave you of Linda, that she would be involved in the Me Too movement, even though I didn't say that, then that is exactly an over-application of a heuristic. Statistically, if you have a condition or a condition plus something, it is more likely that the condition is true rather than the condition plus something. But we tend to think, oh, I'm making sense of the situation. Linda must be both, because it seems to make sense given the information that we had, even though it is actually statistically less likely to be true. Processing fluency is another excellent area of research in this, and it basically says that we react to how hard it is to process information or thinking or problems in a way that doesn't account for the fact that we're giving too much weight to that processing difficulty. So for example, some of the research on accents. So you may have judged me for my American accent, for example. I'm not Canadian, in a specific way that changes how you're seeing the information I presented independently of that information. So some excellent research on this that I wanted to share is actually a study from 2010. And they looked at why and how non-native speech is harder to understand than native speech, and they used different accents. And they had people judge trivia statements spoken in different accents. So things like ants don't sleep, how much this statement is true or that you believe it, etc. People judge statements like that as less true when spoken by a non-native and native speaker. And everybody knew these were trivia statements. It wasn't that they thought that the speaker was coming up with these on their own. So they knew that that accent of the speaker was completely separate from the actual veracity of the statement. But yet, that packaging, in a sense, changed how they viewed that statement. And you might say, well, this could just show stereotyping or bias or discrimination against certain types of accents. But actually, the effect still held when the listeners knew that the accented speakers were merely repeating statements originally, presumably, said by a native speaker. So it's not just that, again, that you're thinking that it's made up by the speaker and it's difficult to understand, therefore don't trust it. You know that the statement is independent of that person, and yet you're still influenced because it's harder for you to understand. The effect is stronger with more difficult to understand accents for you than accents that are easier for you to understand. So we see it in so many ways. And if I haven't depressed you in a sense, let's move to behavior. We quite simply, behaviorally, tend to gravitate to people like us. This is called the homophily effect in the literature. Basically means we gravitate to those like us. You may have heard of things like the echo chamber. There's some studies on Facebook and other platforms like this about how we tend in practice to gather with people who are like us. And like us can be broadly defined: appearance, nationality, age, sure, but also things like our interests, how and where we were educated, our opinions on different matters. And this really shapes how we process and make decisions. And the nefariousness of this effect is that it actually convinces us that we're more right, even though research shows that often the opinion or the final solution of a group is more extreme than the a priori average of the original opinions of individual group members before they talked. So you're actually reaching more extreme answers and becoming more convinced of them because of effects like this idea of the homophily effect. Second, this is also doubly influenced by physical structures around us that we often don't control and don't recognize at all that they influence us. When I used to teach networks and network theory to my undergraduate students, for example, I would always tell them the story of the Fessinger study of MIT's Westgate and Westgate West housing. And the study is brilliant because it really dramatically illustrates this idea of how structures that we don't even think of, because again, we're not looking for them. So inattentional blindness influence what we do and how we think and who we interact with, whom we interact. So in this study, it was graduate students at MIT, and they had a graduate student housing area, sort of like an apartment block, neighborhood type of situation. And people were randomly assigned to apartments in this apartment block. And they did a network study of the friendship dynamics that were forming in this apartment neighborhood. And remember, everybody's randomly assigned to location. And they found that people tended to be closest friends with the person next door on either side. As you went 2 doors down, you were half as likely to be friends, and so on. Nobody had close friends more than 4 doors down. A random assignment to apartment, strong effects. And there was one exception. People tended to be well connected in the network and break this rule of geographic proximity if their apartment was close to the dumpsters, because structurally, everyone had to take their garbage. And so they would see these people in a way that they wouldn't have just based on geographic proximity. And so I always used to joke, you know, my office at a prior institution was very close to a faculty bathroom area. And it turns out I was actually extraordinarily well connected to that network. So sometimes we can use it to our advantage, but it's something to keep in mind because it's such an insidious influence that we never think about. Office locations or house locations or things like this just don't come across our minds. And we're also pretty lazy in how we explain our own and others' behaviors. So theory of mind is the basic idea that I recognize that my thinking and my patterns and what I've seen and understood differ from yours, that you have an independent mind that works separately from mine. It's often developed in childhood, and then, you know, we get better with this over time, but we're never fully perfect. And in a sense, the fundamental attribution error is one example of this. The fundamental attribution error basically says, I tend to give myself the benefit of the doubt and not you. So if I do well, it's because of some consistent characteristic of myself. I'm smart, I worked hard, I put in the effort, etc. If you've done well, maybe the test was easy or the promotion was already in the bag or something like this. If we do badly, it wasn't my fault. The boss was biased, you know, it was already rigged or something like this. If you do badly, well, you didn't work hard enough, you didn't do what you needed to do, your performance wasn't there. So we tend to attribute good things inherently to some aspect of myself, if it's me, and bad things to the situation, and vice versa if it's you. One of the best ways I can illustrate this, if you've ever been driving and someone cut you off and you say, what a rude driver, how terrible are they? It's obviously not the situation that may have prompted them to do that, right? It's because of something about them. They are rude, they're inconsiderate, they're a terrible driver. If you happen to cut someone off, I'm in a rush, I need to get to the hospital, I'm late for this really important meeting, the traffic was horrible, I just had to take an opening when I saw it, right? It's something about the situation, not necessarily about you. So what do we do? And I see that my time is getting tight, so I just wanted to leave you with some thoughts and hopefully haven't depressed you too much with all of these effects that are influencing us all the time, even if we don't know it. And so one of my first pieces of advice is learn to recognize that. The more able you are to see it when it's happening, the better able you are to see patterns in yourself and tendencies that you might not like or might not be what you want, and correct those as you go. And the more you can create ways to catch that in your own life that don't even always depend on you, the better off that you'll be. Meredith and I were talking before the session started about hacking our own lives and how do we create ways to kind of encourage the better nature of ourselves and tamp down some of the more less helpful aspects of our thinking and feeling and behaving. In terms of other people, what I always teach my students is think about how to truly understand the other person. And it doesn't mean that you agree with them, but just that you try to understand them. And the best way I know of how to describe this is to say, if you can say honestly that you know what would make their thinking or behavior or feeling, so whatever is confusing you or that you don't agree with, the right thing to do, then you're halfway to understanding their motivations. If you think someone is crazy or being irrational, I always like to say, and this is kind of my training, so I'll show you my own bias in thinking. It's just that I don't really fully appreciate the regression that's driving their behavior, right? The underlying motivations and variables and coefficients that are making whatever they're doing or thinking or feeling the right thing to be doing or thinking or feeling if I were in that position. Carol Dweck's work, I just love. It's this idea of fluid versus fixed mindset, and it's thinking, you know, can I change and improve, or is it the die is cast? I really can't become better at this. The more you can keep that sort of learning orientation rather than that fixed mindset, performance only orientation, the better off that you'll be. And all of these things, we'll all make mistakes. I continually do, as my students are all too aware. But the key is what you do with those. And I'll teach you one last framework that I share with my students that I found also very helpful in my own life, and that is CONFECT. It's a terrible acronym. I always say, please someone find a better way to explain this. But the idea is that you first think about the concepts and identify the concepts that are influencing you in that moment or in that situation or the other person. So maybe it's one of the biases that I've shared with you today or something that you've read, et cetera. The more able you are to identify those as they're happening or retrospectively as you're thinking about it, the better. But don't stop there. So the FE of CONFEPT is get some feedback, whether it's your own, but more ideally from others. What are you doing well? What did they see happening? It probably differs from your own perceptions of what's happened. What would they tell you to do next? What have you done well that maybe you didn't realize? And then don't stop there, but the final PT is what practical tips can you take? What will you do next time then to be better? Or what process can you put in place to catch yourself so that you can start to train again that habit in a different way? We are creatures of habit and sort of overlearned responses and fundamental reactions and this type of thing. So it's not, most of us are good eggs, to go back to that initial image, but how can we take all this that we know about all of these things often happening completely subconsciously or unconsciously in our own lives that influence us and use them a little bit for the better. So with that, I'll stop there and turn it back to Meredith. I'll stop sharing my slides and I look forward to your questions.
Oh my goodness, Laura, I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. I feel like you could tell us so much more. And we've had some really interesting questions, and I'm gonna try to squeeze a few in. So Nancy Evans asks, I'm old enough to remember when showing emotion at work was considered unprofessional and weak, as in there's no crying in baseball. Is there any evidence that productivity or business outcomes are improved by a work environment where people feel they can be more authentic emotionally?
You know, Nancy, I'm totally with you. And I don't think it's even a remembering. It's still true. I am a woman in a business world who studies emotions. Could I have put myself in a harder position professionally in some sense? And this was a lot of the reason that I got into what I do. Is I got told, be professional. It's not about emotions. You know, it's not personal, it's business, these kinds of mantras. But the more you look at the research behind it, the more you realize all of this stuff is happening whether we recognize it or not. And so, I mean, think about it. If I said, I have a tool that can tell you why people are doing what they're doing, why they're making mistakes or doing really well, how you might shape that, how it changes outcomes, wouldn't you want to know that tool? Yeah, I think everybody would say, what is this magic? How can you predict all of these things? And that is all this work on emotions and cognitive processing. So that there's too much to summarize, but the short answer is yes. There is work that shows the more that you admit these influences and leverage them for better, the more positive outcomes you get in business. Not, I mean, financially and performance-based, sure, but also with employee well-being, productivity, lowered turnover, lowered absenteeism, higher performance, higher loyalty and identification with the organization, yes. And it doesn't mean go amok. We can't all run around just expressing everything we want at any given time. Of course, there's regulation, you know, we need to control our behaviors in some way. This is basic social niceties also. But there's a lot of work, yeah, that shows we're missing out if we don't acknowledge these influences and try to use them. Instead of ignoring them, we can use them to help.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. I don't know if you can speak to this question. We've had a few kind of related to COVID and the fact that with people wearing masks and emotions being concealed, how does that affect the workplace if you can't really read a person's face properly?
Right, such a good question. I actually wrote a few pieces for The Conversation, if you know that publication, on sort of emotions and negotiations, which is a lot of the context that I study in COVID and how we do that. And you could argue that a huge influence of that is, you know, if I cover my face, can you tell as much? So one, an interesting fact is that actually is a big cultural difference. What part of the face we attune to in terms of emotional expression and nonverbal communication actually really differs. Again, it's kind of this broad east-west, which is a really broad brush, doesn't describe everybody accurately, difference of, in the West, we often focus on the bottom half. So if I do this, you think, oh, she's very happy. But if you had noticed, my eyes are not actually smiling. So what parts of the face you attune to are different across cultures. And so in a sense, in the West, we're actually kind of disadvantaged because we are trained naturally to focus more on that bottom half rather than the eyes. And so it would be interesting. I've not seen a summary of this yet, but my guess would be we're taking small steps to verbally communicate what used to be obvious, we think, although we can always misinterpret, from the face. So to say more explicitly when we're communicating with someone what we think may have been obvious from our face, you know, oh, I'm joking with you, or I'm just teasing or something, which would have been obvious if I said it with a smile before.
My resting face is grumpy.
Most people's
Don't worry, my resting face is grumpy. Don't take it personally.
In fact, that's actually true. Most people's resting faces are actually slightly negative in how they're perceived. So there's interesting research about that as well.
Okay. Also on the pandemic theme, in what ways do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has affected our ability to make rational decisions in the modern workplace? For example, under higher stress due to the pandemic, could we be more likely to think in tunnel vision?
Yeah, the research on crisis and things like this shows that when we're under pressure, so time pressure or crisis or something like this, we tend to revert to overlearned responses. So it's why, for example, if you ever had to do a fire drill in your organization or something like this, or on an airplane, they always ask you to read those cards and things like this, and you think, oh, I'll just ignore it, etc. That's an attempt. It's a recognition and an attempt to get you to do the right thing in a time of crisis, because when we're in crisis, we just do what's automatic. It's why you find people who your house is on fire and they'll stop and grab their house keys and their wallet, because you're used to grabbing your house keys and your wallet when you leave home. You're not thinking in that moment, my house is burning down, this is not relevant. You're literally just doing what that overlearned response is, which I think emphasizes in situations like COVID, when we're under constant low level or high level stress, the more we can shape those overlearned habitual responses to be productive and helpful, even better, right? So I think that we're seeing some of this effect of ignoring these influences in normal business kind of dealings. Those are coming back to bite us in a sense now, because we haven't focused, and we've said, no, it's professional, those things don't influence me. They do. And now we're seeing some of those influences in ways that hopefully we're learning to cope with a little bit, but I think there's a lot of room there.
Right. Interesting. Oh, we're getting so many good questions. And of course, we're really close to time. Oh, I just had a good one and then it just slid away. One of the instructors at Queen's said something during training which encouraged us to, when we are dealing with a person we believe is unreasonable, to choose to assume the person is a reasonable person and has a reasonable reason for saying or believing what they do, instead of reacting to what you perceive to be unreasonable, to instead become curious and ask questions to learn why the person says or believes what they do. That is a mouthful. I think this person is asking for you to respond to that notion.
That is exactly what I was trying to highlight on that last slide. Find the regression driving that behavior, because when you can properly specify and identify all of those factors, it's a lot of the work on mutual understanding. It does not mean you have to agree with them, but it helps you understand what's driving them. So instead of thinking this person is irrational versus rational, think everyone is rational. How do I explain that? And that is what helps you understand how to get there. You do not have to agree with them. Right. Absolutely. Totally different question. But to start with the assumption that everyone is rational. Now, how do I explain it?
Okay, excellent. Further to that, what kinds of questions or comments do you suggest we ask or make during decision-making meetings where it seems as though decisions are being made according to those that are the most popular or spoken by people who tend to think the same way?
Oh gosh, there are so many so many pieces to that question. I'm not sure how to answer that in 1 minute, because you're getting at negotiation, you're getting at power, you're getting at perceptions. I think, and I mean, I teach entire courses on negotiation. Let me think of kind of a quick, helpful response. I think two things. One, to recognize that reality is perception. As I always tell my students, very few things can only be seen in one way and defined in one way. Even facts, people say, what are the facts? Or no, any fact can be interpreted. Any fact can be interpreted. If you did well in a performance review, that you can interpret that in a million different ways. So perceptions are reality. Understanding what those perceptions are, where they come from, and how you can influence them, even if you don't have explicit power at the table. Well, that's an entire negotiations course, but that gets you thinking in the right direction, I think. And the question that I always like to ask, and it was on that last slide about kind of challenging assumptions, is that if it seems that something can't be changed or can't be fixed, I have two ways of thinking about this. One is just to say, what if it isn't? Or what if not? So, if you say, well, I have to be at this meeting, but I have this conflict and it's just not possible to work out. And the starting point is I have to be at this meeting. What if not? Could you dial in for part of it? And just taking away that assumption for a minute opens up your mind to think of a lot of more creative possibilities that you might do. And one that I always encourage in my negotiations courses, particularly if there's any kind of conflict involved, is find the way. I think for an American or Canadian, this phrase will make sense. So I have another way of saying it too. Find a way to make the bug into a feature. So put more officially is find the opportunity in the problem. So the thing that you think is tripping you up or is a really big issue, find a way to make that not a problem, but actually a feature. Where's the opportunity in that problem?
Whoa, all right.
Not that I'm perfect at this, for sure. But
I know we told people 45 minutes. We're creeping over ever so slightly. I did want to ask you, somebody has asked an interesting question about with the propagation of emojis. Where do emojis come into the workplace communications? And do they really substitute for emotions?
It's such a good question. There is a whole stream of research on, I think the initial questions was, are they professional? Then it's moved a bit to, well, people use them. So how do we use them? How is it seen? There are, I would say, generational cohort effect differences and how they're used. I was actually reading an article this week that was saying the laughing with tears coming out of your eyes emoji is no longer cool. Apparently only people my age and older use that. The younger generation does not think, they think it's too pat and too overdone. So they'll use these complicated series of emojis to convey a similar thing. So I think it's evolving as we go. Emoji, I mean, even if you look at emoji, which you think might be silly, they reflect so many things about cultural differences, cognitive differences in how we're thinking. So the thing I told you about the different parts of the face that we focus on, if you ask a prototypical Westerner, how would you make a smiley face? I wish I had a whiteboard now. It's the colon and the parentheses, correct?
Yeah.
Now, a sad face, colon, and the other parentheses. So the thing that changed was mouth.
Right.
Westerners tend to focus on the bottom. If you ask, well, at least somewhat my age, in the East, how do you make a smiley face? It's the caret, a line, and a caret. And a sad face is a capital T, a line, and a capital T for the tears.
Oh, interesting.
And the thing that changed is the top half of the face, the eyes, the mouth stayed the same.
Okay.
This is what we're used. So it's basically, we've just found a creative way to express what we do intuitively because we learned it this way if I were seeing you in person.
But if I add a smiley face to the end of my sentence to my colleague, does my colleague all of a sudden think of me as more friendly or more accessible? Or just more silly?
Well, and again, it's a whole stream of research.
Right, okay.
Here, but is it professional? Is it competent? And it's actually evolving as we speak. I have a colleague who studies this very effect on emoji. She's looking also at, online selling. So eBay, if you describe it in a different way or use an emoji or not, and things like this, how does it influence? So I think it's an evolving field. There will be differences in how professional people think it is, for sure. Kind of expected differences by cohort, status level in the organization, this type of thing. But it can help clear up some misunderstandings. There's great research on email communication, and we think that, first of all, we think we're much clearer than readers perceive us. So if I'm sarcastic, it's obvious that I'm sarcastic, it's obvious that I'm angry. Turns out the accuracy is just barely above chance. It's really not good at all. And we tend to think that people who know us well, like our friends, for example, are even better. So that accuracy should increase. It doesn't. It doesn't. So even people who know us well misunderstand us in email as much as people who don't know us at all. So clarity of communication, I would say, and if there's any doubt, And again, think of that other perspective, not yours, because we always think that we're totally clear. You know, avoid it or state it more clearly. If you want to use emoji, that's an open question. I tend to do it with closer calling. I don't do it in full contact. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to advise somebody use emoji, not use emoji, and then get them.
No, of course, but avoiding sarcasm, it sounds like, is probably a good approach.
Really difficult to detect, it turns out. It's extremely difficult, yeah, to detect in written language. Yeah,
really interesting. I'm mindful of our time. I will invite people that if they have to slide out, they will be getting this recording in their email. I'm going to ask you one last one because somebody asks, you mentioned using checklists to catch and correct our assumptions. And this person's hoping that you can expand on that a little bit. I don't know, but maybe it's a good way to end because it was sort of a news you can use thing we can take away with our from the discussion.
Yeah, and I would say the checklist needs to be personal, so I can't give you, these are the 5 things you need to include on the list and only those and nothing else. But the more you pay attention to situations and then try to use my silly concept metaphor or some other process to analyze those in retrospect, you'll notice things and tendencies about yourself that maybe you can put somehow in a checklist to avoid. So if it's that you quickly jump to the worst conclusion or something, that could be on your checklist of like, what would be a more positive interpretation of this? In negotiations, often the biggest piece of advice is to ask why. So if somebody asks you for something, I need the day off, I want to raise, why? So that could be number 1 almost on any checklist, ask why.
What if somebody asks, what if the person doesn't want to answer? What if the person doesn't want to give you an answer of why they need the day off? I mean, just for an example.
And true, there are lots of privacy and confidentiality and kind of general humanity and respect concerns there. So it's worth asking why, because maybe there's another way to help them even better than just giving them the day off, that you could actually find a plan that helps them better somehow. And it's hard to know without knowing a specific situation. But if they say, you know what, thanks for asking, I really can't share, then say, okay, I trust you. But at least you've asked, right? At least you've given the chance of finding out more, maybe creating an even better solution for them, or something like this that can help.
Okay. So what you're basically saying is self-awareness is everything.
I think self-awareness is key, trying to understand what would make them right, and really, not that you have to agree again, but what makes that make sense in a perfectly reasonable way. And it sounds as if others are drawing on that research to give the same kind of advice as well, which makes me very happy.
Okay, well, I hate to have to wrap things up because it's, as I said, we could probably go for hours. But I will thank you, Laura, for your time today on behalf of the audience. We have had a lot of questions, and I'm sorry, audience, that I don't have time to get to more of them. Quickly, before we wrap, I just want to make a plug, as I always do, for Queen's Executive Education at Smith School of Business. There are lots of opportunities at the moment for more online learning. Visit the URL on your screen, smithqueens.com/execed for more programs about what's available now and what's coming up in the future. I also want to plug our next free webinar, which will be taking place next month. We are on a monthly delivery model right now. So put Thursday, March 25th in your calendars at a special time, 9 o'clock. So 9 a.m., not after lunch. You will be perky, full of coffee, 9 a.m. So given the massive upheavals to businesses around the world happening as a result of the pandemic, we'll be offering a guide to corporate distress and credit markets during COVID-19. So we've got our all-star panel of bankruptcy and distress investing experts on board for this one. And I do hope that you will join us. You'll be getting information about it in your inbox in the weeks to come. So stay tuned. Laura Rees, thank you very, very much for your insights today. We really appreciate your time. And thank you, audience, for joining us. And I wish everybody a good rest of the day and good rest of the month till we see you again. Thanks.
Thanks very much.